The air in the great hall smelled of pine smoke and something sharper. Fear maybe, or desperation dressed up as hope. I stood near the back wall, my fingers twisted together so tightly the bones ached, watching the parade of women who'd come from every corner of the kingdom. They wore their finest dresses, their hair braided with ribbons and flowers, their faces painted with confidence I'd never possessed. Each one stepped forward when her name was called, curtsying before the dais where he sat. King Valeric Thornage, the Lycan king, the last of his bloodline. I shouldn't have been here at all. My village had no business sending anyone to the offering. That's what they called it. Though everyone knew it was really a desperate lottery. The king needed an heir. 60 years without one, they said. 60 years of watching his court grow older, his allies grow restless, his enemies grow bold. The kingdom needed stability. It needed a future. It needed someone to give him what decades of trying had failed to produce. But I was nobody. A healer's daughter from a godforsaken village where the roads turned to mud every spring, and the wolves howled so close at night you could hear their breath between the trees. My hair was too pale, my frame too slight, my hands permanently stained with the herbs I ground for my mother's remedies. I didn't even want to be chosen. The very thought made my stomach clench with something between terror and nausea. My mother had insisted, though. They're calling every unmarried woman between 18 and 30, she'd said, her weathered hands gripping my shoulders. If you don't go, they'll punish the whole village. It's just a formality for girls like you. He'll never choose someone so ordinary. The word had stung, even though I knew she meant it as comfort. Now, pressed against the cold stone wall with 50 other women who had far more right to be here than I did, I felt the weight of my own insignificance like a physical thing. The woman beside me, tall, dark-haired, with the bearing of someone born to command, shot me a look that said I was wasting everyone's time just by breathing the same air. She wasn't wrong. The ceremony dragged on. One by one, women approached the king, spoke their names and lineages, displayed whatever talents or beauties they possessed. Some sang, some recited poetry, one actually demonstrated sword work, her blade flashing in the firelight while the crowd murmured approval. The king watched it all with the same expression. Distant, polite, utterly unmoved. His face could have been carved from the same granite as his throne. I'd heard stories about him all my life. How he'd taken the crown at 19 after his parents were killed in the Borderland Wars. How he'd unified the fractured Lycan clans through sheer force of will and strength that made other alphas bow their heads in submission. How he'd searched for years for a mate who could bear him children, only to discover the cruel truth. The war that had made him king had also left him sterile. Poisoned weapons, dark magic. Nobody knew for certain, but the result was the same. No heir, no future. A kingdom built on the strength of one man who would eventually die, leaving only chaos behind. I felt sorry for him, which was probably treasonous. You weren't supposed to pity kings. But standing there watching woman after woman fail to spark even a flicker of interest in those storm-gray eyes, I couldn't help it. What must it feel like to have everything except the one thing that mattered most? My name was called sooner than I expected. Alicia Whitmore of Briar Valley. My heart lurched into my throat. The woman beside me actually laughed, a soft, cruel sound. I forced my feet to move, one step and then another. My simple dress suddenly feeling like burlap compared to the silks and velvets that had come before. The distance to the dais seemed impossible, each step echoing too loud in my ears. When I finally reached the throne, I dropped into a curtsy that wobbled slightly. I kept my eyes on the floor, counting the cracks in the stone, trying to remember how to breathe. Look at me. His voice wasn't what I expected. Low, rough, but not unkind. I lifted my head slowly, and for the first time in my life, I met the eyes of Valeric Thornage. The world seemed to tilt. He was looking at me, actually looking, not through me the way he'd looked at all the others. His eyes were the color of smoke before a storm. And there was something in them I couldn't name. Recognition, maybe, or surprise. His nostrils flared slightly, and I realized with a shock that he was scenting me, the way Lycans did when something caught their attention. "What talent do you bring to offer?" The Chancellor's voice cut through the moment, impatient and dismissive. I swallowed hard. I'm a healer. I know herbs and remedies. I can set bones and treat fever. My voice sounded small even to my own ears. I know it's not much. A healer. The king's voice again, cutting off my apology. He leaned forward slightly, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow me whole. "What's the treatment for silver poisoning?" The question caught me off guard. It was specific, technical, not the kind of thing you asked to make conversation. My mind raced through everything my mother had taught me. Milk thistle and golden seal root ground together with charcoal ash, given 3 times daily with clean water, never wine. The patient needs to be kept cool and quiet. Silver burns from the inside out, so you're fighting inflammation as much as poison. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. And for someone who's been exposed repeatedly over years, then you're not just treating poison. You're treating scar tissue. The organs remember the damage. You'd need blood purifiers, burdock root, dandelion, red clover. Long-term treatment, maybe forever. I hesitated, then pushed forward. And you'd need to accept that some damage can't be undone. Some wounds we carry always. The silence that followed felt enormous. The king stared at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, and I realized every person in the hall was holding their breath. "What's your name again?" he asked quietly. "Alicia, Your Majesty. Alicia Whitmore." He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Then he did something that made the entire court gasp. He stood. The king never stood during the offering. He sat. He listened. He dismissed. Standing meant something. Standing meant attention. Standing meant, "The rest of you are dismissed," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "I've made my choice." Chaos erupted. Women cried out in protest. Families shouted questions. The Chancellor tried to restore order while looking utterly bewildered. But I couldn't hear any of it over the roaring in my ears. The king was still looking at me, and in his eyes, I saw something that terrified me more than rejection ever could. Hope. They took me to chambers I'd only ever imagined in fevered dreams. Rooms so vast my entire village house could have fit inside them 3 times over. Servants dressed me in clothes that felt like water against my skin, soft and impossibly fine, while I stood frozen and uncertain. A woman with kind eyes braided my pale hair with silver thread, whispering reassurances I couldn't quite process. "You'll dine with His Majesty tonight," she said gently. "Just the 2 of you. It's unprecedented. But then, everything about today has been." I wanted to ask what she meant, but my throat had closed around the words. When they finally led me through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, I tried to understand what had happened. The king had chosen me. Out of hundreds of women, daughters of nobles, trained warriors, women bred for exactly this purpose, he'd chosen the girl who ground herbs in a forgotten village. It made no sense. Unless he'd seen something in my answer about silver poisoning. Something that told him I understood more than I should about old wounds and permanent damage. The dining room was smaller than I expected. Intimate, even, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a table set for 2. Valeric stood by the window, his back to me, looking out over the kingdom that bore his name. He'd changed from his formal regalia into simpler clothes, though simple on him still meant finely tailored leather and wool that probably cost more than my family earned in a year. "Your Majesty," I said softly, unsure of the protocol. He turned, and I was struck again by how his presence seemed to fill the space. He was tall, taller than any man I'd ever known, with shoulders that spoke of decades wielding a sword and hands that could probably crush stone. But it was his eyes that held me. Tired eyes, old eyes, in a face that should have been young. Lycans aged slowly. I knew that much. He should have looked barely 30, vital, and strong. Instead, he looked like a man who'd lived 3 lifetimes and hadn't enjoyed any of them. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair. "And please, when we're alone, call me Valeric. I've heard your majesty enough for one day." I sat carefully, hyper-aware of every movement. He took the chair across from me, and servants appeared to pour wine and bring food, roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables I didn't recognize. My stomach was too knotted to eat, but I made myself take small bites to be polite. "You're afraid of me," he said after a moment. It wasn't a question. "I'm afraid of everything right now," I admitted, then immediately regretted the honesty. But he almost smiled. "At least you're honest. Most people lie in my presence. Tell me what they think I want to hear." He took a drink of wine, studying me over the rim of his glass. "How did you know about silver poisoning?" "My mother is a healer. She taught me everything she knows." I hesitated. "We had a family come through our village once. Lycans from the borderlands. They'd been attacked with silver weapons. Most of them died, but one survived. My mother treated him for months. I helped." "Did he recover?" "He lived," I said carefully. "But he was never the same. He couldn't shift anymore. The silver had damaged something fundamental. He left one night and never came back. My mother said some people can't bear to lose what made them whole." Valeric's jaw tightened. "No, they can't." The pieces fell into place then, sharp and painful. The war, the silver weapons, the sterility that had haunted him for decades. I looked at this powerful man, this king who could command armies and break other alphas with a word, and saw the truth. He was broken in the same way that Lycan from the borderlands had been broken. The poison had taken something from him that medicine couldn't restore. "I'm sorry," I whispered. His eyes snapped to mine, sharp with something between anger and surprise. "For what?" "For what was taken from you. For what you've had to carry alone." The silence stretched between us like a living thing. Then Valeric did something unexpected. He laughed, though it sounded more like pain than humor. "Do you know why I chose you today, Alicia?" I shook my head. "Because every other woman in that hall looked at me and saw a crown, a title, power. They saw what they could gain." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You looked at me and saw a person. Someone who'd been hurt and was still hurting. And instead of trying to use that weakness, you offered compassion." "I don't understand why that matters," I said quietly. "You need an heir. I can't give you one any more than I stopped, realizing too late what I was about to say. "Any more than I can give myself one," he finished. "I know. Everyone knows. It's the worst kept secret in the kingdom." He stood abruptly, moving to the fire. "The council has been pressuring me for years to take a wife anyway, for appearance's sake. To solidify alliances, to at least pretend the kingdom has a future." "That sounds lonely," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. He turned to look at me, and I saw something raw in his expression. "It is. It's been lonely for longer than you've been alive." I stood then, drawn by something I couldn't name. I crossed to where he stood, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him. Lycans ran hot, I remembered their blood, fierce and wild. Close enough to see the small scars on his hands, the silver streaks just beginning at his temples, the weight of years in the lines around his eyes. "What if?" I started, then stopped. It was insane. Impossible. But his words echoed in my mind. Some wounds we carry always. What if? What? His voice was gentle, encouraging. What if I told you I see possibility where everyone else sees certainty? That healers are taught never to accept that something is truly impossible until every option has been exhausted. His breath caught. "Alicia." "I'm not promising anything," I said quickly. "I don't have magic or miracles, but I know herbs and remedies that most people have forgotten, old ways passed down through generations. And I know. I gathered my courage. I know that sometimes when everyone tells you something can't be done, they're really saying they don't know how. Valeric stared at me like I'd just offered him the world. His hand lifted, hesitated, then gently touched my cheek. His palm was warm, calloused, trembling slightly. "You don't know what you're saying," he whispered. "The hope alone could destroy me." "Then don't hope," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "Just let me try. Not because you chose me or because there's a crown involved, but because no one should have to carry what you carry without someone standing beside them." Something broke in his expression then. Some wall he'd built over decades of disappointment. He pulled me close, not romantically, but desperately, like a drowning man grasping for solid ground. I felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Felt the shudder that ran through his powerful frame. "I don't deserve this," he said against my hair. "I don't deserve you." "Maybe not," I agreed, and felt him huff a surprised laugh. "But I'm here anyway." We stood like that for a long moment, the fire crackling beside us. Two broken people holding each other together. And for the first time since my name was called in that hall, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could do this. Not because I was special or chosen or destined, but because sometimes the greatest strength is simply refusing to let someone face their demons alone. The weeks that followed were nothing like I'd imagined a royal marriage would be. There was no grand wedding ceremony, no public celebration. Instead, Valeric and I were bound in a private ritual attended only by his most trusted advisors and the high priestess who'd served his family for generations. The woman's ancient eyes had studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, but she'd said nothing except the traditional words that made me queen. Queen. The title felt like a costume that didn't fit. But the work, that I understood. I spent my days in the castle's vast library, buried in texts so old the pages crumbled at my touch. Medical treatises written in languages I had to learn. Herbalism guides from cultures that had long since vanished. Alchemical journals that blurred the line between science and magic. Valeric gave me access to everything, including records that detailed his condition with clinical precision. Silver toxicity. Chronic and severe exposure over 3 years during the Borderland Wars. Reproductive system damaged beyond conventional healing. 60 years of failed treatments, failed hopes, failed everything. But I also found something else in those records. Gaps. Moments where the physicians had simply stopped trying, declared it impossible, moved on. They'd treated the symptoms, but never addressed the root. The silver particles that had embedded themselves in his tissue, slowly poisoning him year after year. "You're going to make yourself sick," Valeric said one evening, finding me surrounded by books in what had become my personal study. "You haven't eaten since breakfast." I looked up, pushing pale hair from my face. "Did you know that the mountain clans used to treat silver poisoning with a compound made from moonflower and wolfsbane? Both are toxic on their own, but together, in precise doses." I gestured to the open book. "They supposedly neutralized the silver." He sat beside me, his presence warm and steady. Over the weeks, we developed an easy companionship. Not the passionate romance the court whispered about, but something quieter, more real. We talked late into the night about everything and nothing. He told me about the weight of the crown, the constant pressure of keeping the kingdom safe. I told me about my village, about grinding herbs by moonlight with my mother, about the small magics of healing that most people never noticed. "Supposedly," he repeated, catching on the word. "Meaning it might not work. Meaning it's worth trying." I turned to face him fully. "Valeric, I've been documenting everything. Your energy levels, your ability to shift, even subtle things like how quickly you heal from minor cuts. You're not just sterile. You're slowly being poisoned still. The silver is still in you, still doing damage." His jaw tightened. "I know. I've known for years. But what if we could remove it? Not just treat the symptoms. but actually extract the poison. I pulled another book closer, showing him diagrams I'd sketched. It would take time. Months, maybe longer. And it would be. I hesitated. It would be painful. The process of purging something that's been part of your body for so long. I don't care about pain. His hand covered mine, warm and solid. I've lived with pain for decades. But I need you to understand something. His gray eyes held mine with painful honesty. Even if we remove every trace of silver, even if we somehow heal the damage, there's no guarantee. The physicians were very clear. The scarring, the time elapsed. I know, I said softly. I know it might not work. I know we might do everything right and still fail. But at least you'd be free of the poison. At least you'd be healthier, stronger. Isn't that worth something? He studied me for a long moment, then pulled me close. This had become our habit. These moments of quiet contact, his arms around me, my head against his chest. Not passion, but comfort. Trust. You're remarkable. You know that, he murmured. I smiled against his shirt. I'm stubborn. There's a difference. No, he said firmly. You're remarkable. And brave. And far too good for a broken king. I pulled back to look at him. Stop calling yourself broken. You survived a war that killed hundreds. You've kept this kingdom together through sheer will. You're still here, still fighting. That's not broken, Valeric. That's strength. Something shifted in his expression. That look he got sometimes, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. Then he kissed me. Gentle and careful, and I felt the tremor in his hands that said he was holding back. We'd shared kisses before. Quiet moments stolen between duty and research. But this one felt different. This one tasted like hope. When we parted, he rested his forehead against mine. When do we start? Tomorrow, I said. I'll need to prepare the first compound tonight. It's going to be intense, Valeric. You'll need to trust me completely. I already do. The next morning, I began the treatment in earnest. The private chamber we'd converted into a healing room smelled of herbs and smoke, the windows covered to control the light. Valeric lay on the padded table, stripped to the waist, his muscular frame tense with anticipation. This first dose will make you feel like you're burning from the inside, I warned, measuring the dark liquid carefully. Your body is going to fight it because it can't tell the difference between the medicine and more poison. You'll need to stay conscious, stay focused. Can you do that? Yes. No hesitation. Just absolute trust. I administered the compound, then sat beside him, holding his hand. Within minutes, his breathing turned ragged. Sweat beaded on his skin. His grip on my hand turned crushing, but I didn't pull away. I just kept talking, keeping him grounded. You're doing well. The pain means it's working. The medicine is finding the silver particles, binding to them. Just breathe through it. I'm right here. An hour passed, then two. The lyric's body convulsed several times, his Lycan healing fighting against the treatment. But he never cried out. Never asked me to stop. He just held on to me like an anchor in a storm. When it finally subsided, he lay panting and exhausted, his skin pale and clammy. How do you feel? I asked, wiping his face with a cool cloth. Like I'd been torn apart and reassembled, he rasped. Then, incredibly, he smiled. But also, lighter. Like something's been loosened. I checked his vital signs, documenting everything. That's good. That's exactly what should happen. We'll do this twice a week for the next 3 months, gradually increasing the dosage as your body adapts. He caught my hand, kissing my knuckles. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We have a long way to go. But as the weeks turned into months, something miraculous began to happen. Valeric grew stronger. His shifts, which had been painful and incomplete for years, became easier. His color improved. His energy returned. The court noticed, whispering about the young queen who'd somehow brought vitality back to their king. What they didn't see were the private moments. Valeric holding me through nightmares about failing him. Me holding him through the brutal treatment sessions that left him hollowed out and trembling. What they didn't see was how we'd slowly, carefully fallen in love. Not the explosive, dramatic love of legends, but the steady, earned love of two people who'd seen each other at their weakest and chosen to stay. On the night of the 4th month, after a particularly difficult treatment, Valeric pulled me into bed beside him, something we'd been building towards slowly, carefully, respecting the weight of what it meant. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, his fingers tracing patterns on my shoulder. "Even if this doesn't work the way we hope, even if I never give you children, I want you to know you've already given me more than I ever thought I'd have. You've given me hope, peace, a reason to believe in tomorrow." I turned in his arms, meeting his storm gray eyes. "And you've given me purpose. A place to belong. Someone who sees me as more than just ordinary. You were never ordinary," he whispered. "From the moment you looked at me and saw a person instead of a crown, you were extraordinary." When we came together that night, it was with the tenderness of people who'd earned every touch, every whispered word. And later, wrapped in his arms with moonlight streaming through the windows, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, miracles weren't impossible after all. Just incredibly, beautifully difficult. The morning sickness started exactly 6 weeks after that night. Though I didn't recognize it at first, I attributed the nausea to exhaustion. I'd been working relentlessly, documenting every aspect of Valeric's treatment, corresponding with healers across the kingdom who might have additional insights. When I fainted during a council meeting, the king's personal physician was summoned immediately. Dr. Helena was a stern woman in her 60s who'd served the crown for decades. She examined me with brisk efficiency, while Valeric paced the room like a caged wolf, his anxiety rolling off him in waves. "Well," he demanded when she finally stepped back. Helena's weathered face was unreadable. "Your Majesty, I need to run additional tests. Lady, I'll need a blood sample." Something in her tone made my stomach clench with a different kind of nausea. Valeric heard it too. His pacing stopped abruptly. "Helena, what is it?" "I cannot say with certainty until." "Helena." His voice dropped to that tone that made even his generals straighten their spines. "Tell me." The physician looked between us, and I saw something I'd never seen in her stern features. Wonder. "I believe the queen may be with child. Possibly children. But Your Majesty, given your condition, I must verify this through multiple means before." The room tilted. Valeric caught me before I could fall, his hands trembling as he lowered me gently onto the settee. His face had gone absolutely white. "That's not possible," he said hoarsely. "It's not. Helena, you know it's not. I know what the records say. I know." She interrupted gently. "I also know what I'm observing. Let me run the tests. Please." The next 3 hours were the longest of my life. Helena drew blood, performed examinations I barely registered, consulted texts and instruments while Valeric and I sat in stunned silence. He held my hands so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers, but I didn't complain. I was too busy trying to process the impossible. Pregnant. With his child. With his children. When Helena finally returned, she wasn't alone. She'd brought the High Priestess, the same ancient woman who'd married us months ago. The priestess's milky eyes fixed on me with that unnerving intensity. "It is confirmed," Helena said, her voice shaking slightly. "The queen carries twins. Both healthy. Both strong. Your Majesty, I have no medical explanation for this. By every measure we have, this should not be possible." Valeric made a sound like he'd been struck. His grip on my hand loosened, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might collapse. But then he was moving, dropping to his knees before me, his head in my lap, his powerful shoulders shaking with sobs he'd probably held back for 60 years. I ran my fingers through his hair, my own tears falling freely. "It's real," I whispered. "Valeric, it's real." The high priestess stepped forward, placing a gnarled hand on each of our heads. "The old magic recognizes what science cannot explain," she said in her cracked glass voice. "You healed more than his body, young queen. You healed his spirit. His hope. His will to believe. And belief, combined with love freely given." She smiled, revealing too many teeth. "That is the oldest magic of all." The news spread through the castle like wildfire, and within days, through the entire kingdom. The sterile king, the cursed king, some had called him, would have heirs after all. Not one, but two. The Thornage line would continue. The celebrations were immediate and overwhelming. But they also brought danger. "There will be those who see this as a threat," Valeric said one night, his hand protective over my still flat stomach. We were in our private chambers, away from the endless well-wishers and festivities. Other Lycan clans who've been positioning themselves as my successors. Nobles who've built power assuming the crown would be up for grabs when I died. I know. I'd thought about little else. We're disrupting decades of careful planning. His jaw tightened. "I've already increased security. No one gets near you without my explicit permission. But..." He cupped my face gently. "I need you to promise me something. If anything happens, if anyone threatens you or the children, you run. You don't try to be brave. You don't try to reason with them. You run, and you let me handle it. Valeric, please." The word was raw. "I've just gotten everything I never thought I could have. I can't." His voice broke. "I can't lose you. I can't lose them. Not after this. Not after finally understanding what it means to have something worth living for." I pulled him close, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. "You won't lose us. We're stronger together, remember? That's what got us here." But my words proved prophetic sooner than I'd hoped. 2 months into my pregnancy, when my body had begun to show the subtle changes that confirmed the miracle growing inside me, an assassination attempt shattered the fragile peace. Poison in my evening tea, carefully crafted to seem like a natural miscarriage. If I hadn't been a healer myself, if I hadn't recognized the bitter undertone beneath the chamomile, I would have drunk it without question. Instead, I called for the guards. The interrogation revealed a conspiracy that ran deep. A coalition of 3 noble families who'd decided that a queen who could give the king heirs was too dangerous to their ambitions. They'd planned to eliminate me, let Valeric's grief consume him, then position their own candidates as his consolation brides. Valeric's rage was terrible to behold. He executed the conspirators himself in the old way, shifted into his massive wolf form and delivered justice with teeth and claw. I should have been horrified. Instead, watching him defend our family with such primal ferocity, I felt safe. For the first time since the pregnancy was confirmed. But the attempt left scars deeper than physical wounds. "I should send you away," Valeric said that night, holding me as I trembled with delayed shock. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere hidden until the children are born." "No." My voice was firm despite the fear. "We don't hide. We don't let them think they can break us. We stand together. And we show them that the kingdom has a future. A strong one." He pulled back to look at me, and I saw both pride and terror in his eyes. "When did you become so brave?" "When I had something worth being brave for." The next morning, we made a public appearance. The first since the assassination attempt. Valeric stood before the assembled court, his presence radiating controlled violence, while I stood beside him with my hand resting on my growing belly. "Let me be absolutely clear," the king said, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. "Queen Alicia carries the future of this kingdom. Anyone who threatens her, who plots against her, who even thinks about harming what is mine, will learn exactly why I have held this crown for 60 years. There will be no mercy. No second chances. No forgiveness. The silence was absolute. Then, to my surprise, one of the older lords, a man I'd barely spoken to, stood and placed his fist over his heart in the traditional gesture of fealty. "Long live the king," he called out. "Long live the queen. Long live the heirs of Thornage." One by one, others stood. The gesture spread through the hall like ripples in a pond until every person present had risen, their fists over their hearts, their voices joining in a chorus that shook the rafters. For the first time since becoming queen, I felt the full weight of what we'd accomplished. Not just a pregnancy. Not just heirs. But hope. Real, tangible hope for a kingdom that had been slowly dying. That evening, alone in our chambers, Valeric knelt before me and pressed his ear to my belly, listening for the heartbeats that were growing stronger every day. "I can hear them," he whispered, wonder filling his voice. "Both of them fighting for space already," I laughed, running my fingers through his hair. "They're your children. Of course they're fighters." He looked up at me, and I saw tears tracking down his scarred face. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "For believing when no one else did. For seeing possibility where everyone else saw impossibility. For giving me a reason to keep fighting." "We gave each other that," I corrected gently. "You taught me I was stronger than I knew. I just reminded you of the same." He rose and kissed me then, deep and slow, and filled with a love that had been earned through pain and perseverance and unwavering faith in each other. Outside our windows, the kingdom slept peacefully, protected by a king who had finally found his purpose, and a queen who had discovered her own strength. And inside me, 2 small heartbeats echoed like promises of the future we'd fought so hard to create. The twins were born on the first night of winter, during a snowstorm so fierce the entire castle shook with wind. Labor came fast and hard, weeks earlier than Dr. Helena had predicted, and I learned exactly how much pain a body could endure before breaking. Valeric refused to leave my side, despite tradition dictating that kings wait elsewhere during births. He held my hand through every contraction, his own face gray with helpless fear as I screamed through the worst of it. When Helena finally said I needed to push, his grip became my anchor to consciousness. "You can do this," he whispered fiercely against my ear. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do this, Alicia. I'm right here. I'm not leaving." The first baby came with a wail that cut through the storm. A girl with pale hair and lungs like a battle horn. Valeric sobbed openly when Helena placed her in his arms. This massive warrior king cradling something so impossibly tiny and perfect. "She's beautiful," he choked out. "She's... Look at her. She's..." But there was no time for wonder. The second baby was coming, and something was wrong. I felt it in the way Helena's hands moved with urgent precision. Heard it in the sharp commands she barked at her assistants. The room blurred around me as pain gave way to a distant floating sensation that terrified me more than the agony had. "Stay with me." Valeric's voice cut through the fog. He passed our daughter to a nurse and was back at my side, his face inches from mine. "Alicia, stay with me. Don't you dare leave me now. We're so close. Just a little more. Stay." I focused on his storm gray eyes, on the love and desperation I saw there, and I pushed with everything I had left. The second baby came in a rush. Another cry, weaker than the first, but growing stronger. "A boy," Helena announced. Smaller than his sister, but fighting just as hard. "Twins," I whispered as Valeric carefully placed our son in my other arm, our daughter already nestled against my chest. "We made twins." "You made miracles," he corrected, his voice breaking. "You made my entire world." The recovery was long and difficult. My body had given everything to bring those babies into existence, and for weeks I was as weak as a newborn myself. But Valeric was there for every moment. Changing cloths, bringing food, taking night shifts with the twins when they woke crying. The king of all Lycans, powerful enough to crush rebellions with his bare hands, learned to swaddle and soothe and sing lullabies in a surprisingly gentle voice. The kingdom celebrated for a month straight. Gifts arrived from every corner of the realm and beyond. Rival clans who'd been enemies for generations sent tributes, acknowledging that the Thornage line was secured. The succession was safe. The future was certain. We named them carefully, with intention. Our daughter became Sarah, meaning bright light, because she'd been the first to prove the impossible was real. Our son became Rowan, meaning strength, because he'd fought his way into the world with the same determination his father had shown in surviving 60 years of disappointment. When Sarah was 3 months old, she shifted for the first time, far earlier than any Lycan child in recorded history. Valeric had been holding her, making faces to earn one of her rare smiles, when suddenly his arms were full of a tiny silver wolf pup with eyes too intelligent for an infant. He'd looked at me with such profound joy, I'd started crying. "She's powerful," he'd whispered in awe. "Alicia, she's going to be extraordinary." Rowan shifted 2 weeks later, his wolf form smaller but faster than his sisters. Watching them tumble together in their puppy forms, play fighting and yipping, Valeric and I held each other and marveled at the life we'd built. But the true test came when Sarah was 6 months old. A delegation arrived from the northern clans, alphas who'd been circling since the twins' birth, looking for weakness or opportunity. They demanded an audience, claiming they needed to verify the legitimacy of the heirs. Everyone knew what they really wanted, to assess whether these miracle children posed a genuine threat to their own power. Valeric wanted to refuse them entry. I convinced him otherwise. "Let them come," I said firmly, Rowan sleeping against my shoulder while Sarah played with my hair. "Let them see exactly what we've created. Not just heirs, but a family. Strength born from love instead of conquest. That's more threatening than any display of power." The audience took place in the throne room, formal and tense. The northern alphas, 3 massive males with more scars than diplomacy, studied us with calculating eyes. Valeric sat on his throne with the authority of decades. But I stood beside him with our children, refusing to be relegated to the background. "These are the miracle heirs," the lead alpha said, his tone making the word miracle sound like an insult. "Forgive our skepticism, Your Majesty, but the entire realm knows of your condition. Some wonder if perhaps they're not mine?" Valeric's voice could have cut glass. "Let me save you the trouble of whatever insult you were planning." He stood, descending from the dais to stand directly before the alphas. "My children carry my scent, my bloodline, my strength. Every Lycan in this room can sense it. So if you're here to question their legitimacy, you're wasting everyone's time." The alpha's eyes narrowed. "With respect, unusual circumstances demand unusual verification. Perhaps if the Queen would submit to—" "The Queen submits to nothing," I interrupted, my voice ringing clear through the hall. I handed Rowan to a trusted nurse and stepped forward with Sarah in my arms. "But if you need proof of what my children are, I'll show you." I looked down at my daughter, who was watching the alphas with unsettling focus for a 6-month-old. "Sarah, sweetheart. Can you show them what you are?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, my daughter shifted. Smooth and controlled in a way that should have been impossible for one so young. The tiny silver wolf in my arms locked eyes with the northern alpha and released a sound that was part growl, part howl. Every Lycan in the room instinctively dropped their heads in submission. The sound carried power, authority, the unmistakable mark of a dominant bloodline. Even the alphas, proud males who'd likely never bowed to anyone but Valeric, felt the weight of it. "That," Valeric said quietly into the shocked silence, "is my daughter. My heir. Born from a love strong enough to break curses and defy every limitation the world tried to place on us." He moved to my side, placing his hand on my back. "And this is my queen, who saw an impossible future and had the courage to reach for it." The lead alpha stared at us for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he knelt. "Forgive my doubt, Your Majesty. The North recognizes the strength of your line." His eyes met mine with newfound respect. "And the wisdom of your queen." After they left, after the court had dispersed and the children were finally asleep in their nursery, Valeric pulled me onto the balcony overlooking the snow-covered kingdom. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Being chosen that day? Having your entire life upended for a king most people thought was cursed?" I looked out at the peaceful realm, then up at the man who'd become my entire world. "Every day," I said, and felt him tense. "I regret that we didn't have more time. That you suffered alone for so long before I found you. That it took 60 years for you to know what it feels like to hold your own children." His arms tightened around me. "But I don't regret us," I continued. "I don't regret the work, or the fear, or the moments I thought we'd fail. Because every bit of struggle led to this. To Sarah and Rowan. To a kingdom with hope. To you, smiling, instead of carrying the weight of the world alone." He turned me to face him, cupping my face with those scarred, gentle hands. "I spent 6 decades believing I was broken beyond repair. That the best I could do was hold things together until I died. And then you walked into that hall, looked at me like I was worth saving, and changed everything." "We changed everything," I corrected. "Together." "Together," he agreed, and kissed me with the tenderness of someone who'd learned that the greatest strength wasn't in power or dominance, but in the courage to be vulnerable with someone who'd earned your trust. Years later, when Sarah and Rowan were old enough to ask about how their parents met, I would tell them the truth. That miracles aren't born from magic or destiny, but from the relentless belief that impossible simply means no one's tried hard enough yet. That love isn't weakness, it's the force that makes ordinary people capable of extraordinary things." And when they asked if their father had really been cursed, Valeric would pull them close and smile. That real, unguarded smile he'd learned to wear. And say, "No, little ones. I was just waiting. Waiting for someone brave enough to see that curses are only as permanent as we allow them to be." We ruled together for decades. The king who'd survived the impossible, and the healer who'd taught him to believe again. We watched our children grow into leaders who carried both strength and compassion. We built a kingdom where hope wasn't a luxury, but a foundation. And every night, in the quiet moments before sleep, Valeric would hold me close and whisper the same words. "Thank you for choosing to stay." And I would answer, always, "Thank you for being worth it." Because in the end, that's what love really is. Not the grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the choice to stay. To fight. To believe. Even when the whole world says it's impossible. We'd proven them all wrong. And we'd do it again, every single time. You have just listened to a tale from the Moonlight Mates Library. If Valeric and Alicia's journey touched your heart, please leave a like and share this story with someone who believes in miracles. And I'm curious, tell me in the comments below, if you were in Alicia's shoes, standing in that great hall, would you have been brave enough to choose the cursed king? To uncover more stories of fated mates, forbidden love, and happy endings, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. The library is always open for you. Until the next chapter, sweet dreams.